Hello. First of all, I need to apologize because I cannot speak in Spanish to you. I wish I could because it's been the language of this conference, which I enjoyed immensely. But I would rather be able to have a command of what I'm saying. And so my name is Barbara Mercato. I come from Venice. I have a PhD from the University of Venice, which dates back 20 years. And I have not done anything academic since. So I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference for accepting my abstract and my request to participate, because when I saw the two words poetica and politica together, I said, you know, I must be there because these are the kind of two pivots of my life. So I really wanted to be here. And the reason also why I want to participate is because when about 10 years ago, when I finished my PhD and I did my PhD, I was studying the development of a poetry scene in Toronto, of all places, a city in Canada, which is in some way the opposite of Venice, because I live in a city which, when you say just the name, Venetia, Venice, there is a kind of cloud of associations, of images that we all have. And I don't know about you, but if I say Toronto, especially 20 years ago, I didn't have a network of images or other things, associations, literary associations that I have. So I tried to reconstruct the genealogy that brought a city which in the 50s was considered the epitome of dull, backwater, boring, religious city, to a very vibrant scene in the 80s, starting in the 80s. And when I was there in the early 2000s, what happened? I was walking around the city, going to bookshops, which are always the first thing I visit in a city, especially when I can speak the language. I even do it here, but I can't speak the language. And I realized that there were shelves, entire shelves of Canadian poetry published by medium, small, very small publishing houses by unknown Canadian poets. But in every bookshop I went, I saw these masses of poetry books by Canadian poets. And then, because I like poetry, I started seeing that there was notices for poetry readings, and I attended poetry readings in cafes, and I started noticing that there was poetry on buses. It's a public program that was in many cities publishing poetry on buses. And I saw people reading poems in parks. And then one day I even found a poem stuck with a little bit of tape in a bathroom, written by the bathrooms and elevators poetry plot. So I thought, you know, where does this come from? How did it go from no poetry, no literature at all to so much poetry everywhere? How does it happen, and how does it happen around the city? So, of course, I'm not going to discuss my PhD. I'm going straight to the conclusions. After a lot of interviews, I'm going around, talking to people, reading a lot. I saw that the poetry scene that I was seeing so scattered around the city was really the result of negotiations between two poles, let's say. On one side, the community of poets, who were getting together, running the independent poetry series, stamping their little independent books and giving them away in their small circles. And on the other hand, the institutions. In Canada, there was a huge effort to create a national culture. Canadians felt that they needed to invest in creating a national culture because they felt overwhelmed by the US neighbors. More or less at the same time, in the 50s, the first group of poets started getting together to do the independent poetry magazines. They were using finally the mimeograph machine, ciclostil, I think it's called in Spanish, ciclostil in Italian, which made it brought a huge leap forward in the dissemination of independent poetry, because finally they were able to disseminate more copies. And almost at the same time, the Canada Council was born. The Canada Council is this huge institution in Canada, funding agency for culture. And but what happens is once you start subsidizing culture, for example, even in the year 2000, if you had a bar and you wanted to invite a poet to read in your bar, You filled in the form, you sent it to the Canada Council, and they sent you $100 to contribute for this reading, which is in some sense science fictional, but it opens a big question that I want to throw out on the floor to you. It is a good thing to have money for making culture, but it doesn't come without a side effect. Because once you start subsidizing, you need categories, you need forms, you need to fit in a certain. So you have to, yes, for example, if you want to have money for your small publishing house, you need to publish at least 500 copies of books that have at least 50 pages. And this, for a poetry book, is not so, it doesn't come natural. So you have a kind of, there was a poet in the 60s who said that the Canada Council funding was like methadone, because people wanted to access the funding, and they changed their dynamics, they changed their way of working in order to access funding. And at the opening of my paper, I used a quotation from Adorno, who wrote an essay called Culture and Administration, and he says, culture suffers damage when it is planned and administered. On the other hand, if it's left to itself, everything cultural threatens not only to lose its cultural effect, but its very existence as well. So what I saw in Toronto basically was the fact that on one hand, you had these very independent groups of poets who very soon started to have a polemical approach towards the funding and said, we don't want to be the ones who fill in the forms and who conform to your categories. We are going to disseminate a kind of poetry books that are more, we decide what is the good book. It's a small group of many small groups and very competitive groups of poets who would rather who try to escape very consciously this whole idea of the subsidizing. And I think the subsidizing is one good example of this, the helping hand being the good, what is the taking care mythology, no? And they started to try and produce books which were the opposite of what could be subsidized. And for example, they started to fight the idea of enshrine, to say, to mythologize the art book. They were completely against the idea of the artist book or of the commodified object of culture of the book. And they tried to do editions that were very easy to lose in the archives, in the libraries. For example, they changed the format every time. They did magazines that they had, the issue number 1 followed by issue number 8, because they said, we want to confuse the librarians, we want to make people not really understand what these things are. So the whole idea of my PhD was the fact that you can really see it happen. You see the parallel development of communities and how they grow into more and more. They set up small festivals, reading series, and so on, and how this is almost inevitably drawn to the more institutionalized thing. Toronto now has the biggest poetry prize in the world, for example. It's set up by a huge, railway tycoon who loves poetry, and so there is this huge thing with thousands of people going to the final evening of this prize. And of course, this dynamic is open. It's not that all the good things are on the community side and on the bad sides are on the institutional side, but I sort of offer it up to you as a theme for consideration as to how these two things should come together and how only a city is actually the perfect setting for this kind of exchange, because poets move around, they have their small reading places, the small cafe, they change from one place to the other, they go to each other's homes, they meet in parks for readings. And I had a beautiful photo from a newspaper in the 60s saying police silenced poets in Allen Park because there was just a poet reading in a park. But back then, you couldn't do any public speaking in parks, so the police arrived and arrested all the poets. And it was a good occasion to start a discussion about the fact that public spaces had to be open to all sorts of speaking, and that poetry was part of this public life. See, I'm glad we arrived at the end because this was my PhD, but I wanted to find a connection with the theme of this conference. And as you can imagine, when I read, and of course there are many intermediate bodies between the community and the institution, for example, the leagues of poets and so on. And it is the city that makes the importance of these fringe activities come to the surface, because you can see them scattered in different places and so on. So they create a sort of different canon as opposed to whether a poem is good or not, who decides that? It doesn't matter if you look at it from an urban space point of view. You have another hierarchy coming up. You have another way of deciding what is important to the city. But when I read the quotation that you found on the postcard that I give you, when Lefebvre says, quoting Hölderlin, quoting Heidegger, quoting Hölderlin, that human being cannot do anything but inhabit as poet, I asked myself, what does it mean to live as a poet? And of course, he wasn't thinking only about poets, the real poets, let's say, in poets stricto sensu. He's speaking about all of us. So I tried to answer this question, what does it mean to live poetically? And I think that in his case, to inhabit as a poet is first of all a political act. And therefore it is the expression of what I think I would like to call the poetical politics. And so I'll just give you my idea of what poetical politics might mean. And I also think that poetical politics might be a good alternative to the kind of professional, technical politics that we've been told should solve all problems but didn't work very well. Maybe it's time for a real shift to a poetical politics. And I think that poetical politics means, first of all, to acknowledge the inevitability of living poetically. And poetical politics is made by comunità immaginanti. I think it's comunidades imaginantes, not imagined communities, but imagining communities who dare to think visions and share them. And political politics fights commodification because it pays attention to the symbolic value of things and the creation of value outside the logics of the market, because they do make things, but for example, that's why I wanted to bring you something which is on handmade paper, and that I hope, you need to have something which stays as a kind of, to remember that there are also things that make up our cultural lives. And I think poetical politics negotiates the value of every unit of sense. And it detaches desire from the commodified objects. It creates desire for other kinds of objects that are special, tiny, disseminated, tactically, and so on. And poetical politics sees the imagination. And here I quote my favorite poet, who is Wallace Stevens, who is the opposite of Lefebvre and the opposite of all these very Marxist thinkers. He was a lawyer in an insurance company, but he had a real crazy imagination. And he said that the imagination is a violence from within that protects us from a violence from outside. It is the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. So I think this is a very crucial thing to me, that there is always a violence of the imagination because there is a violence coming from outside. But at the same time, poetical politics turns the imagination into actions, into acts that are imbued with collectively negotiated meaning. Poetical politics stands for listening carefully. Before you said, it also looking carefully, listening carefully is a political act, it can be. And also poetical politics acknowledges the intrinsic value of every space, but especially urban space, as an important actor in human life. Poetical politics cherishes invention. And throughout the book and in the conclusion of the urban revolution, Lefebvre laments the passivity of the people who are most involved, most directly involved in the dynamics that he describes. And I think this is the time where the issue in which the word poesis comes to use. Poesis, from which poetry comes, is from Greek, from a Greek verb poieo. And I actually looked it up on the Greek dictionary because I wanted to give you the exact definition of what it means. Poieo, from which the word poetry comes, means to act, to be active, to bring into action. And I think this has a huge transformative potential. So I think, to me, poetical politics means breaking out, piercing this film of passivity, and putting out through this film of passivity a hand, a touching hand that can taste and test the life of the city. Because I think this too is a fight, a vital fight for and inside the invented urban space. And I think that if poetry can change us, it can also change the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.